The Final Haunting, a sculptor's dark secret unveiled, must-watch mystery. Chapter 1. The Village of Shadows. The village lay cradled in the hollow of a rugged cliff, where the land met the restless sea. Its air, always damp with the mist that rolled in from the Atlantic, carried the briny tang of salt and the murmur of secrets. Narrow lanes, paved with uneven cobblestones, twisted like veins through the cluster of weathered houses. These homes, with their slate roofs and ivy-clad walls, seemed as ancient as the stones themselves, huddled together as if to ward off some unseen menace. To the casual observer, the village might have appeared quaint, picturesque even, with its windswept cottages and the gray silhouette of the church tower presiding over the harbor. But to those who lingered long enough, there was an unsettling quality beneath the surface. The villagers moved about their daily tasks with a wariness that spoke of unspoken fears. Conversations were brief, conducted in low voices, as if even the walls had ears. There was a sense that the place was suspended in time, where the old legends whispered by the elders held more weight than the ticking of any clock. At the edge of the village, where the cobblestones gave way to a rough dirt path, stood a mansion. Its grandeur had long since faded, leaving behind a structure that was as much a part of the landscape as the cliffs themselves. The mansion, once a stately home of some long-forgotten family, now appeared to be on the brink of collapse, its walls overrun by moss and creeping vines. The windows, clouded with years of neglect, offered no glimpse into the secrets they concealed. It was here, in this forsaken place, that Henry Blackwood resided. Few in the village had ever seen him, and those who had spoke of a man burdened by his own creations. Henry was an artist, but not in the way that one might expect. His sculptures, renowned yet feared, bore a lifelike quality that sent shivers down the spine of any who gazed upon them for too long. Each piece seemed to capture more than just the physical form of its subject. There was an uncanny depth to them, a sense that they might stir to life at any moment. Henry himself was a figure of mystery. Tall and gaunt, with a brooding countenance that matched the stormy skies above, he seldom ventured beyond the confines of his mansion. When he did, it was always at twilight, when the village was wrapped in shadow. The villagers whispered that he was cursed, that his art had come at a terrible price. Children were warned to stay away from the mansion, lest they fall under the same dark spell that had claimed the sculptor. It was into this atmosphere of unease that Eliza Turner arrived. She was a striking contrast to the somber tones of the village, with her vibrant youth and the determined glint in her eyes. London had been her home, a city teeming with life and opportunity, but it had also been the setting of her greatest sorrow. The loss of a loved one had left her adrift, searching for meaning in a world that suddenly seemed vast and empty. The rumors of Henry Blackwood's sculptures had intrigued her, offering a distraction from her grief and a purpose to pursue. Eliza's first impression of the village was one of isolation. The train had deposited her at a small, desolate station, where the only sign of life was an old man who offered her a ride in his weathered cart. As they trundled along the uneven road, the village had appeared through the fog like a specter, its outlines blurred and uncertain. She had felt a shiver of apprehension, but had dismissed it as mere nerves. After all, she had come here for a reason. The cottage she had rented was modest but comfortable, with a small garden overrun by wildflowers and a view of the sea that stretched to the horizon. It was a place where one could lose themselves in thought, surrounded by the gentle yet persistent sound of the waves. But Eliza had not come here to lose herself. She had come to discover. And the first mystery she intended to unravel was that of Henry Blackwood. As she unpacked her bags and settled into the cottage, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It wasn't the first time she had felt this since arriving. The villagers had regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, their eyes following her every move. But this was different. It was as if the very village itself was observing her, judging whether she was worthy of the secrets it held. Night fell quickly in the village, the darkness closing in as the last light of day faded from the sky. Eliza stood at the window, staring out at the distant silhouette of the mansion, its outline just visible against the dim glow of the moon. She felt a pull towards it, an almost magnetic attraction that she couldn't explain. She knew that in the coming days, she would have to visit that place, to meet the man who had inspired such fear and fascination. And though she couldn't have known it then, that meeting would change the course of her life forever. Chapter 2: The Sculptor's Sanctuary. The following morning, as the village still slumbered beneath a veil of mist, Eliza set out towards the mansion that had drawn her here. The path was overgrown, choked with wild brambles and nettles, as if nature itself sought to keep intruders at bay. The air was thick with moisture, and the distant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs provided a constant, rhythmic backdrop. The mansion loomed ahead, its crumbling facade a testament to the passage of time and the weight of secrets it held. Eliza hesitated at the wrought iron gates, now rusted and nearly consumed by ivy. A sign, faded and barely legible, warned trespassers to stay away. She took a deep breath, pushing the gate open with a creak that echoed in the stillness. The courtyard was overrun with weeds, the once grand fountain at its center dry and cracked. The mansion itself, with its peeling paint and broken windows, seemed to exhale a sigh of desolation. Yet, despite its state of decay, there was a strange allure to the place, a whisper of something waiting to be discovered. She approached the heavy oak door, her heart pounding in her chest. After a moment's hesitation, she raised the brass knocker and let it fall. The sound reverberated through the silence, startling a flock of birds from the eaves. She waited, unsure if anyone would answer, but then the door creaked open just enough for her to catch a glimpse of a shadowed figure within. "Yes?" The voice was low, almost a growl as if unused to speaking. Eliza cleared her throat, summoning her courage. "Mr. Blackwood, my name is Eliza Turner. I'm an art historian, and I've traveled from London to see your work. I've heard so much about it, and I would be honored if you might allow me to view it." There was a long pause, during which Eliza felt the weight of unseen eyes upon her. Finally, the door opened wider, revealing Henry Blackwood in the flesh. He was taller than she had imagined, his frame gaunt and almost skeletal beneath a dark, threadbare coat. His hair, once jet black, was now streaked with silver, and his eyes, deep set and shadowed, held an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Without a word, he turned and retreated into the darkness of the mansion, leaving the door ajar. Eliza took this as an invitation and stepped inside, her footsteps echoing on the cold stone floor. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and she found herself enveloped in an oppressive gloom. The entry hall was vast, its ceilings high and adorned with the remnants of intricate plasterwork. A grand staircase spiraled upward into shadows, and corridors branched off into unknown depths. But it was not the architecture that caught her attention. It was the sculptures. They lined the walls, stood on pedestals, and filled every available space. Figures of men, women, and children, each captured in a moment of profound emotion. Their eyes seemed to follow her as she moved, their expressions so lifelike that it was almost impossible to believe they were mere stone. Eliza felt a cold sweat on the back of her neck as she walked deeper into the mansion. The air was thick, tinged with the scent of damp stone and something else, something she couldn't quite place. It was as if the very walls were alive, holding their breath, waiting. Henry led her to a dimly lit gallery, where more sculptures awaited. This room, though large, felt suffocating, the walls closing in as the figures loomed over her. She could feel the weight of their gazes, and an inexplicable sense of dread settled over her. "These are my works," Henry said, his voice flat. He did not look at her, instead keeping his eyes on the sculptures. "You wanted to see them, and now you have." Eliza took a step closer to one of the sculptures, a woman with a look of pure despair etched into her features. The detail was astonishing. Every line, every crease in her skin seemed so real, but it was the eyes that captivated her. They were filled with such raw emotion that Eliza felt a pang of sorrow deep within her. "They're extraordinary," she whispered, almost to herself. Henry's expression darkened, and for a moment, Eliza thought he might order her to leave. But then his shoulders slumped, and the hardness in his eyes softened just a fraction. "They are not what they seem," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Eliza wanted to ask him what he meant, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, She watched him as he moved among the sculptures, his hand brushing against them as if they were old friends, or perhaps old enemies. There was a sadness in his movements, a heaviness that seemed to weigh him down. "These sculptures," Eliza began cautiously, "they are so lifelike. It's as if they're trying to tell a story, to communicate something." Henry stopped in front of a figure of a young girl, her face frozen in an expression of terror. His fingers grazed the cold stone of her cheek. "They are," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it is not a story you want to hear." Eliza felt a chill run through her. There was something in his tone, a darkness that hinted at unspeakable things. "Please, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I want to understand. Your work, it's unlike anything I've ever seen. There's a truth in it, something that speaks to the very soul." Henry turned to face her, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, recognition perhaps, or maybe just wariness. "You say you want to understand," he said, his voice rough. "But understanding comes at a price. Are you willing to pay it?" Eliza hesitated, the weight of his words settling on her. "I am," she said finally, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. For a long moment, Henry stared at her, as if searching for something in her eyes. Then he nodded, almost imperceptibly. "Very well," he said. "But know this. Once you start down this path, there is no turning back. The truth is a burden, not a gift." Eliza swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. She had come here seeking answers, but now that they were within reach, she wasn't sure if she wanted them after all. But it was too late to turn back. The door to the mansion had closed behind her, and the shadows were closing in. As she followed Henry deeper into the mansion, the atmosphere grew colder, the darkness thicker. The sculptures, which had seemed merely unsettling before, now took on a menacing air, their eyes watching her every move. And then, just at the edge of her vision, she saw it, a flicker of movement, a shadow darting between the statues. Eliza stopped, her breath catching in her throat. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Henry paused, turning slowly to look at her. "See what?" "A shadow. I thought I saw something move." Henry's expression remained impassive, but there was a tension in his stance. "This house plays tricks on the mind," he said. "It's easy to imagine things that aren't there." But Eliza wasn't so sure. There was something about this place, something alive in the very walls. She could feel it, a presence that lingered just out of sight, watching, waiting. As they continued down the corridor, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that the sculptures were more than just stone. They were alive, in a way she couldn't explain, and they were trying to tell her something. But what? By the time they reached the heart of the mansion, Eliza was trembling, though whether from fear or excitement, she couldn't say. Henry stopped in front of a massive door, its wood blackened with age. "Are you sure you want to continue?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Eliza nodded, though her heart screamed at her to turn and run. She had come too far to back down now. Whatever secrets this mansion held, she would uncover them, no matter the cost. Henry pushed the door open, and they stepped inside. The room beyond was vast, the ceiling lost in shadow. But it was the sculptures that drew Eliza's attention. Dozens of them, maybe more, each more lifelike than the last. And in the center of the room stood a single figure, so realistic that it seemed to breathe. Eliza's breath caught in her throat as she approached it. The figure was a woman, her face a perfect blend of sorrow and defiance. But there was something else, something that made Eliza's skin crawl. The eyes, they were too real, too human. She reached out a hand, her fingers trembling as they hovered just above the cold stone. "Who is she?" Eliza whispered. Henry's voice was a hollow echo in the darkness. "She was someone I loved and someone I lost." Eliza's fingers brushed the stone, and in that moment, the truth came crashing down on her. This was not just a sculpture. This was something more, something terrible. But before she could speak, before she could even process what she had just realized, the room seemed to close in around her. The sculptures, once still and silent, now seemed to pulse with life, their eyes following her every move. And then, from somewhere in the darkness, came a whisper. A voice, so soft and so full of pain that it sent a shiver down her spine. "Help me." Eliza jerked her hand back, her heart racing. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. But Henry was already moving, his face a mask of anguish. "We need to leave," he said, his voice tight. "Now." Eliza didn't argue. As they hurried back through the mansion, the shadows seemed to close in around them, the whispers growing louder, more desperate. By the time they reached the front door, Eliza was gasping for breath, her mind reeling from what she had seen, from what she had heard. She had come seeking answers, but all she had found were more questions, and a terror that she couldn't shake. As the door slammed shut behind her, Eliza turned to Henry, her eyes wide with fear. "What is this place?" she demanded. Henry's face was pale, his eyes haunted. "It's a prison," he said softly. "A prison for the souls I could not save." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Eliza alone in the cold, dark night, her mind racing with the horrors she had just witnessed. The mansion, with its dark corridors and lifelike sculptures, was no mere gallery of art. It was a sanctuary for lost souls, a place where the past and present collided in a terrifying dance of death and despair. And Eliza, now trapped within its grasp, would soon discover that the mansion's secrets were far darker and far more dangerous than she could ever have imagined. Chapter 3: The Unveiling of the Past. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the walls of the dimly lit room. Eliza sat in a worn armchair, her eyes fixed on Henry, who stood by the mantelpiece, his gaze distant, his expression etched with a sorrow that seemed to age him far beyond his years. The silence between them was heavy, laden with the unspoken weight of a story that had been festering in the dark corners of his mind for too long. Finally, Henry spoke, his voice hoarse and brittle as if each word was pulled from the depths of his being. "Isabel," he began, and Eliza could hear the tremor in his voice, "was the light of my life. Her laughter was a melody that could lift the heaviest of hearts, and her art, it was like nothing I had ever seen. She had a way of seeing the world, of capturing it in her paintings, that made everything else seem dull by comparison." He paused, his hand trembling as he reached for a glass of brandy. He took a sip, as if the liquid might steady the storm brewing inside him. "We were inseparable, she and I. Our souls were intertwined in a way that defied explanation. But our love, it was cursed from the very beginning." Eliza leaned forward, her heart aching at the anguish in his voice. "What happened?" she asked softly, though she dreaded the answer. Henry let out a ragged breath, his eyes closing as if he could block out the memories that tormented him. "She fell ill, suddenly and without warning. The doctors were baffled. They called it a mystery, a sickness that slowly drained the life from her, leaving her a shadow of the woman she once was." His voice broke, and for a moment he was silent, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his grief. "I couldn't bear to watch her slip away," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I became obsessed, driven by a madness I couldn't control. I wanted to preserve her, to capture her essence before it was lost to the void. I started sculpting her, over and over, trying to hold on to the woman I loved. But no matter how many statues I created, it was never enough. Her spirit, it was slipping through my fingers like sand." Eliza felt a chill run down her spine as she listened, the room seeming to grow colder with each passing moment. She could see the torment in Henry's eyes, the haunted look of a man who had seen too much, done too much in the name of love. "But it wasn't enough," he said, his voice hollow. "I knew that no matter how lifelike the sculptures were, they were still just stone. And so, in my desperation, I made a pact, a foolish, desperate pact, with a force I did not understand. I sacrificed a part of my soul, and in return, the sculptures came to life. They moved, they breathed. But they were not Isabel. They were something else, something twisted and wrong, and they were not alone." Eliza's breath caught in her throat. "The other sculptures, they contain souls as well?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Henry nodded, his face ashen. "Each one, a vessel for a tormented soul. They haunt me, Eliza. I hear their whispers in the night, feel their cold breath on my skin. They are trapped, just as Isabel is trapped, bound to this house, to me, by a curse I cannot break." Eliza's heart ached for the man before her, a man who had lost everything in his quest to hold on to the woman he loved. But alongside her pity, there was a growing determination, a resolve to find a way to undo the horrors that had been wrought. "I will help you," she said, her voice firm. "There has to be a way to free them, to give them peace. Henry looked at her, a flicker of hope in his eyes, but it was quickly extinguished by the weight of his guilt. "I don't deserve peace," he murmured. "Not after what I've done." Eliza shook her head, rising to stand before him. "It's not about what you deserve, Henry. It's about righting a wrong, about giving those souls the rest they need. And Isabel, she would want you to find peace, wouldn't she?" Henry's gaze faltered, and for a moment, he looked like a lost child, desperate for comfort. "Yes," he whispered, his voice breaking. "She would." Eliza placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "Then we will find a way," she said, her voice filled with a quiet determination. "I will do whatever it takes." As she spoke, she could feel the weight of the task ahead, the darkness that surrounded the mansion, pressing in on them. But she would not be deterred. She had come here for answers, and now that she had them, she would not rest until she had freed the spirits that haunted this place. She would find a way to break the curse, to bring peace to the tormented souls, and perhaps, in doing so, she would help Henry find the redemption he so desperately sought. But as she left Henry that night, retreating to the small room she had been given, Eliza could not shake the feeling that the mansion itself was watching her, waiting to see if she would succeed, or if she too would fall victim to the darkness that dwelled within its walls. Chapter 4. The Haunting Intensifies. The days in the mansion had begun to blur together, a disorienting blend of time that seemed to stretch and contract at will. Eliza found herself losing track of the hours, the sunlight that occasionally filtered through the grimy windows, feeling like a rare and fleeting visitor. The air inside the house was thick, almost suffocating, as if it held the weight of centuries, pressing down on anyone who dared to linger too long. It was on one such dreary afternoon, as the rain lashed against the windows, that Eliza first noticed the change in the sculptures. She had been studying a particularly haunting piece, an elderly man with hollow eyes, his face contorted in anguish. She could have sworn that the lines of his face had shifted slightly, the expression more pained, the eyes more desperate. She shook her head, trying to dismiss it as a trick of the light or the weariness that seemed to settle in her bones. But as she moved from room to room, the feeling grew stronger. The sculptures were changing. Their stone features, once frozen in time, now seemed alive, filled with a restless energy that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Whispers, soft and indistinct, filled the air, like the wind sighing through a forest, just beyond the edge of comprehension. The words were elusive, but the tone was unmistakable. Pleading, insistent, full of a desperation that made Eliza's heart race. The nights were worse. Sleep, when it came, was fitful, plagued by dreams so vivid that Eliza would wake with her pulse pounding, her sheets tangled around her like a shroud. The visions were not merely dreams, they were memories, fragments of lives that had been trapped within the cold stone of the sculptures. In her dreams, she was not herself. She became the souls that had been captured, living their final moments over and over again. She felt the icy grip of fear as the old man reached out to his children, only to see them turn to dust before his eyes. She experienced the heart-wrenching sorrow of a young woman, her lover leaving her behind in a storm of unspoken words. And always, always, there was Isabel, her face pale and drawn, her voice echoing in the corners of Eliza's mind, a warning that had come too late. One night, after yet another restless sleep, Eliza woke in a cold sweat, the remnants of a vision clinging to her like a shadow. She had seen Isabel's final moments, the room dimly lit by flickering candlelight, the scent of lavender mingling with the sharp tang of blood. Isabel's voice had been weak, a whisper filled with urgency as she tried to warn Henry, her fingers clutching at his sleeve as he knelt by her bedside, his eyes wild with a grief that had already begun to twist into something darker. "Don't," Isabel had pleaded, her voice cracking with the effort. "Please, Henry, don't. It's too dangerous." But Henry, blinded by his desperation to hold on to her, had not heeded her words. He had made his choice, sealed their fate with a kiss that tasted of tears and regret. Isabel's spirit, trapped by the very love that had once sustained her, had been trying to reach Henry ever since, to undo the damage he had wrought, to free the souls he had unwittingly imprisoned. Determined to find answers, Eliza spent the next morning combing through the mansion's vast library, its shelves lined with dusty tomes that had not been touched in years. She searched for anything that might offer a clue, some way to break the curse that bound the spirits to their stone prisons. But the books were silent, their pages brittle with age, offering no comfort, no guidance. It was by chance that she discovered the journal. The book was hidden behind a loose brick in the wall of Isabel's old studio, a place that had been left untouched since her passing. The journal was small, bound in worn leather, its pages filled with delicate script that spoke of a love both passionate and tragic. As Eliza read, she could feel Isabel's presence, her voice clear and strong, as if she were speaking to her from across the veil of time. The entries began with joy, Isabel writing of her love for Henry, of their shared dreams and ambitions. But as the illness took hold, the tone grew darker, her words tinged with fear and despair. She wrote of Henry's obsession, how it had consumed him, driving him to the brink of madness. And then, in the final pages, she described the ritual, the one Henry had used to infuse life into the sculptures. But there was more. Isabel had discovered a way to reverse the curse, a ritual that could free the trapped souls. But the ritual required a sacrifice, a great one, willingly given. It was a choice that only Henry could make, a price that he must pay with his own hands. As Eliza closed the journal, her mind swirled with the gravity of what she had uncovered. The truth was now laid bare before her, the path forward illuminated by the flickering light of the past. But the way ahead was fraught with danger, and the cost of failure would be unbearable. With the journal clutched tightly in her hands, Eliza knew what she had to do. She had come to this place seeking answers, and now she had them. But the answers were only the beginning. The real challenge lay in convincing Henry to face the truth, to accept the consequences of his actions, and to make the ultimate sacrifice to set the spirits free. As she descended the winding staircase, the shadows lengthening around her, Eliza felt the weight of her task settle on her shoulders. The mansion seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the whispers growing louder, the sculptures watching her every move. Time was running out, and the darkness that had claimed so many souls was closing in. But Eliza would not falter. She had come this far, and she would see it through to the end, no matter the cost. Chapter 5: The Final Confrontation. The mansion was hushed, its vast corridors cloaked in shadows, as if holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Eliza had spent the entire night preparing, her thoughts heavy with the weight of the task before her. She had tried to sleep, but the mansion offered no solace. The very walls seemed to pulse with an uneasy energy, a reminder of the restless souls that lingered within. With the journal in hand, she approached Henry, finding him in the studio where so much of his pain had been immortalized in stone. He was seated before Isabel's sculpture, his gaze distant, lost in the folds of memory. The dim light from the window cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the deep lines of sorrow etched into his features. Eliza hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. "Henry," she began, holding out the journal, "I found this in Isabel's studio. It's time. You have to perform the ritual." He looked up at her, his eyes clouded with a mix of fear and resignation. The journal trembled in her hands as she passed it to him, the final piece of a puzzle he had been too afraid to complete. Henry took the journal, his fingers brushing over the worn leather, as if it were a relic of a past he could not bear to revisit. "You don't understand, Eliza," he murmured, his voice tinged with despair. "If I do this, if I let them go, I might lose everything. The art, the passion, it's all tied to the force I invoked. Without it, I might be nothing." Eliza knelt beside him, her hand gently resting on his arm. "Henry, look around you. This mansion is a prison, not just for the spirits, but for you as well. You've trapped yourself in a web of grief and guilt, and it's tearing you apart. You have to let them go, and you have to let Isabel go." His face crumpled at the mention of Isabel's name, and he closed his eyes, a deep sigh escaping his lips. "I don't know if I can," he whispered, the words filled with a lifetime of anguish. Eliza tightened her grip on his arm. "You can, Henry. You must. If you don't, you'll lose far more than your art. You'll lose yourself." The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken fears and regrets. Then, with a sudden resolve, Henry rose to his feet, the journal still clutched in his hand. "I'll do it," he said quietly, as if trying to convince himself as much as her. For Isabel, and for them. The grand hall was cavernous, its soaring ceilings and faded grandeur lending an air of solemnity to what was about to take place. Eliza and Henry arranged the sculptures in a circle, each one facing inward as if bearing silent witness to their own fate. The air was heavy with anticipation, the atmosphere electric with the presence of the unseen. Henry stood at the center of the circle, the journal open before him on a pedestal. His voice was low, almost reverent, as he began to chant the words of the ritual, his hands trembling with the gravity of the moment. The candles flickered, their flames dancing to an unseen rhythm as the spirits within the sculptures began to stir. Eliza watched in awe as the figures slowly came to life, their stone forms dissolving into shadowy apparitions. The air was filled with their whispers, a chorus of voices that seemed to swirl around the room, each one echoing with the pain of a life cut short, a story left unfinished. But it was Isabel's figure that drew her gaze the most. She was the last to emerge, her spirit flickering like a dying ember as Henry's voice faltered. She was as beautiful as Eliza had imagined, her translucent form a ghostly reflection of the woman she had once been. As the ritual neared its climax, Henry turned to face Isabel's sculpture, his chisel raised high. But before he could strike, Isabel's voice filled the room, clear and strong, as if she were standing beside him in the flesh. "Henry, stop!" The chisel hovered in the air, Henry frozen in place as her words washed over him. "Isabel," he breathed, his voice breaking. Her gaze softened, a sad smile playing on her lips. "You've held on to me for so long, my love, but it's not the dark force that binds me here. It's you, your grief, your refusal to let me go. You must move on, Henry. You must let me go." Tears welled in Henry's eyes, the weight of her words crashing over him like a tidal wave. "But I can't," he choked out. "I can't lose you again." "You haven't lost me, Henry," Isabel whispered, her voice gentle. "I'll always be a part of you, but you have to set me free. You have to let go." The room was deathly quiet, the only sound the soft crackling of the candles. Henry's grip on the chisel tightened, his knuckles white with the effort to keep himself steady. The choice before him was unbearable, the thought of destroying the sculpture, and with it, the last tangible connection to Isabel, was almost too much to bear. But as he looked into Isabel's eyes, those familiar eyes that had once been filled with so much life, he knew what he had to do. With a final, heart-wrenching cry, Henry brought the chisel down, shattering the sculpture into 1,000 pieces. The moment the stone broke, the spirits were released, their forms dissolving into the air like mist in the morning sun. The mansion seemed to exhale, the oppressive weight lifting as the souls were finally freed from their prison. Isabel's spirit lingered for a moment longer, her form shimmering in the fading light. She looked at Henry one last time, her expression one of peace and acceptance. "Goodbye, my love," she whispered, and then she was gone, her presence fading into the ether. Henry collapsed to the ground, the chisel slipping from his grasp as the full weight of what he had done settled over him. Eliza rushed to his side, her heart breaking for the man who had sacrificed so much. But as she looked around the now quiet mansion, she knew that they had done the right thing. The spirits were at peace, and so, finally, was Henry. The curse had been broken, but the cost had been great. Henry's artistic gift, once fueled by the dark force that had claimed so many souls, was gone. But in its place, there was something far more valuable, a sense of closure, of healing that had eluded him for so long. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Eliza helped Henry to his feet. The mansion, once a place of torment, now felt lighter, as if the very walls had been cleansed of the darkness that had taken root there. Together, they walked out of the grand hall, leaving the shattered remnants of the past behind them. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, it was filled with hope. Chapter 6: The Aftermath. The sun's first light crept through the ancient windows of the mansion, casting golden beams over the dust-laden floor. The air was charged with a strange, serene energy, as if the very soul of the house had been purified by the events that had just transpired. The grand hall, once the site of so much torment and despair, now stood as a monument to a different kind of power, the power of release, of freedom. The spirits, long trapped within their cold stone prisons, had finally been set free. As each sculpture crumbled to dust, the figures within had risen, their forms glowing with a soft, ethereal light. Eliza had watched in awe as they ascended, their expressions no longer twisted in anguish but serene content. They had lingered for just a moment, as if to say their final goodbyes, before dissolving into the light that now filled the mansion, their presence dissipating like a morning mist. Henry, who had been at the center of it all, had collapsed in the aftermath, his body and spirit utterly spent. He lay on the cold floor of the grand hall, his breathing shallow, but his face peaceful. The haunting weight that had pressed down on him for so long was finally lifted. The oppressive darkness that had clung to the mansion's walls was gone, replaced by a sense of calm that neither of them had ever known within these confines. Eliza knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "Henry," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of relief and sadness. He opened his eyes, blinking up at her as if seeing her for the first time. "It's over, isn't it?" he asked, his voice weak but filled with an unmistakable note of hope. She nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Yes, Henry, it's over. They're free, you're free." He closed his eyes again, a single tear slipping down his cheek. "Thank you, Eliza," he murmured, "for everything. You've given me a chance to be something more than the sum of my mistakes. I don't deserve it, but thank you." There was a new softness in his voice, a humility that had not been there before. The man who had once been consumed by grief, who had sacrificed so much in his obsession to bring back what he had lost, was now a man who had finally found peace, not through his art, but through letting go. As the hours passed, the mansion seemed to breathe easier, its long-held secrets finally laid to rest. The light that streamed through the windows was warm and welcoming, banishing the shadows that had lurked in every corner. Henry, though still weakened by the ordeal, slowly regained his strength. He moved through the house with a quiet reverence, as if rediscovering it anew. But as much as the mansion had changed, so too had Henry. The once tortured artist was now a man stripped of the power that had once defined him. His gift, that dark and twisted talent that had drawn him down such a perilous path, was gone. Yet in its place, there was something else, a sense of clarity, of purpose, that he had never known before. Eliza watched as he began to rebuild, not as a sculptor, but as a man seeking redemption. The mansion, now cleansed of its malevolent energy, became a sanctuary rather than a prison. Together they worked to repair the damage, to restore it to a place of peace and reflection. There was a bond between them now, forged in the fires of their shared struggle, and though it was unspoken, it was deep and unbreakable. But Eliza knew her time here was coming to an end. The mansion, the village, even Henry himself, these were all parts of a life she had helped to heal, but they were not her own. Her work was done, and it was time to move on. One crisp morning, as the leaves began to turn the colors of autumn, she packed her belongings, her heart heavy but resolute. Henry stood in the doorway as she prepared to leave, his eyes filled with gratitude and something more, a silent plea for her to stay. But she shook her head, offering him a gentle smile. "You have your path now, Henry," she said softly. "It's time for me to find mine." He nodded, though his expression was tinged with sadness. "I'll never forget what you've done for me, Eliza. You've given me back my life." "And you've taught me more than you know," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Take care, Henry." With that, she turned and walked away from the mansion, the crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound as she made her way down the path. The air was crisp and clear, and with each step she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. The mansion, with all its dark history, was behind her now, but the lessons it had taught her would remain. As she returned to her small cottage on the edge of the village, she felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, but also a lingering sense of unease. It was as if a part of her was still tethered to that place, to the spirits she had helped set free. She pushed the thought aside as she stepped inside, the familiar surroundings of her home bringing a measure of comfort. But as she settled in, her eyes were drawn to something on the mantelpiece. It was a small sculpture, simple and unadorned, that she had never seen before. a figure of a woman, standing with an air of quiet dignity. There was something about it that stirred a memory, something that sent a chill down her spine. Eliza approached the sculpture, her heart beating faster. The details were delicate, almost lifelike, and as she studied the face, she realized with a start that it bore an uncanny resemblance to her own. The eyes, though made of stone, seemed to follow her every movement, filled with a quiet sorrow that sent a shiver through her. Her breath caught in her throat as the realization dawned on her. This was Henry's final creation, made in the moments before the ritual had shattered his gift. A part of her essence, her very soul, had been captured in that sculpture, bound to the mansion just as the spirits had been before her. Eliza took a step back, her mind racing. Had she truly escaped, or had she merely traded one form of captivity for another? The thought was as unsettling as it was inescapable. She had freed the spirits, yes, but in doing so, had she condemned herself to a different kind of haunting? She reached out to touch the sculpture, her fingers brushing the cold stone. A sense of foreboding washed over her, and for a moment she considered destroying it, ridding herself of this last remnant of the mansion's power. But as she stood there, her hand hovering over the figure, she couldn't bring herself to do it. Instead, she stepped back, her gaze lingering on the sculpture's sorrowful eyes. She would keep it, for now. A reminder, perhaps, of the choices she had made, of the dangers of obsession and the power of redemption. But also as a warning that some haunts are not so easily left behind, and that the past, no matter how distant, always leaves its mark. As she turned away, Eliza knew that the mansion's hold on her was not yet fully broken. But she also knew that she had the strength to face whatever lay ahead. She had survived the darkness once. She could do so again.